Hey everybody, Quantum back here again, and in this video I wanted to take a look at Emerald Steel for your store set championships occurring over these next 2 weeks. This is a deck that I haven't really explored or tested too much on my channel into the Inklands meta, but I do think that this is going to be one of the most, if not the most popular deck that you will see at a locals level. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and I'll explain why in just a second. Before I go forward though, exploring this matchup, which I do think is one of the worst matchups for Emerald Steel in the Steel Amethyst deck, and I'll explain that in a bit as well. I just want to say, while I wasn't planning to attend any of my store set championships, just because again, I've just been so busy and can't really carve out time on the weekends to spend a lot of time at a tournament, I woke up this Saturday on the 20th and saw that my store had local tickets, talked it over with my wife, and she seemed okay to a certain degree with me going, so I called the store, made sure it was okay, sleeved up a deck that morning, and I sleeved up Emerald Steel, which in hindsight was probably kind of dumb since I don't have too much experience with it. But I wasn't really feeling too comfortable with Ruby Amethyst because, again, I haven't really put in that many reps with the deck in a while. I decided to go and just try my luck. And I almost made top 8 just on tiebreakers. I didn't, and I can cover that in a tournament report. But I want to talk a little bit about this deck, and if you're planning to go to a couple store set championships or even just the one for your locals, why you should be aware of this deck and or consider playing it yourself or consider some options to tech against it. With a locals, you got to remember that, well, again, it depends on yours, right? But you got to remember that it's not always going to be like everybody having all the most expensive cards. You're in a top end of a tournament. It's not like a Pixelborn tournament where everybody has, access to all the best cards all the time. People are going to have budget decks. People are going to have aggro decks. In-person play, paper play is going to be much different than Pixelborn. Pixelborn automatically counts lore for you, remembers all of your triggers for you, does all of those things, right? In-person play is different. So people might opt to play simpler decks. People might opt to play more, again, straightforward, aggro-focused decks. And Emerald Steel does really well into that field, into the randomness that you might encounter at a local level, because you have a very large early game removal package in all those Steel songs. Let the Storm Rage On, Strength of a Raging Fire, Along Came Zeus, and you have very efficient ways to sing those songs in the Emerald package with the Ursula Deceiver of All. But also, if you're playing the lower to the ground version or even the higher shift variant, you have just a lot of characters that can sing those songs in general, right? Your Benjas if you're running them, your Beast, Tragic Heroes, there's just a lot, right? Like if you're running the Daisy Ducks and all that, like Prince John can even sing stuff, like a lot of 3 cost and above characters to sing those songs. So it allows you to stabilize with aggro and you not have to worry about that randomness factor. And then on the top end of the meta, once you break through and maybe you're doing really well and you're like, okay, now I'm going to start facing the Steel songs and the Ruby Sapphires and all that stuff, the deck can actually still hold its own. Like I said, I think Amethyst Steel gives it some of the worst trouble. And again, I'll cover this matchup in just a bit. But here you see us on the draw in this matchup, and we're able to go pretty wide here. And I've talked about this before. You can't play scared all the time. Like you can't just say, my opponent has Tinkerbell and I grab your swords, I just lose. Right? Like, yeah, you're going to lose anyways then. So you just have to keep playing your deck the way it is. And it's funny because I actually, one of my matches, I could have 2-0'd my opponent, but they ended up 2-1ing me because I played and they were in top deck mode. And I'm like, if you top deck a song for your Ursula, because we were in the mirror match, I was like, you can definitely get back into this game. But if they didn't top deck a song, I'm pretty sure I would have had that game on lock because they only had an Ursula and a Prince John. And what they ended up top decking was like crazy. I'll cover it in a tournament report, but stay tuned for that if you're interested. But into the top end, this deck can do very well. There was, at my store set championships, I think there were 9 Emerald decks out of like 23 or 24 players or something like that. So almost half of the people there were playing Emerald, and I think all but like maybe 1 or 2 were on Emerald Steel. There were a couple Emerald Amethyst. I know for sure there was at least one because I played them and was able to beat them, but which, there's not... It's like this deck is supposed to beat Emerald Amethyst, so it's a bad matchup for my opponent there. So sorry if you ever see this. It's how it goes, right? Every deck has good and bad matchups, I guess. But it just goes to show you that a lot of people valued, I guess, the ability to have that coverage of being able to deal with the randomness of a locals, but also be functional on the top end. And this deck, you might think like, oh, Whole New World and other Steel decks just wreck it, right? And to a certain degree, it can, but what do people do when they play a whole new world, right? What does Sapphire Steel do? What does Amber Steel Song do? They're flooding the board. They're inking aggressively because they're getting down to those final few cards so that they can whole new world into advantage. Because what's the point of whole new worlding if it doesn't get them any advantage and it just gives you 7 fresh cards as well, right? It's just a tempo loss for the opponent. So when you see that kind of play pattern happening, as an Emerald Steel player, you can just be like, okay, well, now I'm ready to cast my Ursula Deceiver. Now I'm ready to sing my Sudden Chill and make you discard 2 or whatever off my Ursula Deceiver. Now I'm ready to make you discard your hand, double discard your hand, or see what you have and force the discard, or whatever it might be, in order to strategically play around those threats. Again, it doesn't always work out, but it's one of the resilient ways that this deck can push through that disruption and force those discards. Now, I will say my version that I ended up sleeving up, unfortunately, isn't as good as the version I'm playing here, which is weird, because if I could take it back, I would opt to include the Donald Ducks in my version, and it's because when you go up against other steel decks, so again, similar to like what you're seeing here in this matchup, you really rely on your Prince John engine with your discard in order to draw you cards, and if your opponent is playing with no hand, your Prince John is offline, right? You kind of rely on, Prince John. I don't want to say rely on because it's definitely not a reliable thing. Your opponent will find ways to play around it for sure if they're a good player. But you should not rely on your Prince John sitting there and your Merfolk and your Flynn Rider questing, and then you telling your opponent, yeah, good luck outing my cards here because you're going to have to discard, and I'm going to draw cards off my Prince John. So this is a net +1 for me, where I've gained my lore. So it's technically like a net +2 because I gain lore as a +1, then I make you discard as a +1. I lose my character, so that's a -1, but then I +1 when I draw again off my Prince John. So the interaction is overall fantastic for me. I'm continuing to aggro. Yes, you're outing my board, so it's a bit of a tempo loss, but I get to replenish my hand off the Prince John, and you have to discard. So when your Prince John engine is offline, it's kind of like, what else do I have to go to in order to draw cards? Well, being on Steel, you have literally a 1-card draw engine in the Beast Tragic Hero. But again, if you're anticipating a lot of mirror matches, if you're anticipating, a lot of meta heavy decks like Amber Steel Song, I think mine had like 3 or 4 Amber Steel Song players, a lot of steel in the meta, you can bet that Beast Tragic Hero isn't going to sit there undamaged and just draw you cards. It's going to get damaged. It's going to be a 7/5 body, which is kind of nice if it doesn't get just straight up removed with, like, let's say, Along Came Zeus. You're not going to draw off that either. So that brings you down to Donald Duck, where Donald can take some damage as long as he doesn't get Zeused as well. But if your opponent opts to draw and then you can force the discard when you have a Prince John on field, that's just extra advantage. Then you might think, well, then your opponent just doesn't draw. And then you can say, well, that's fine because I'll continue to draw 2 anyways. You can stay with your empty hand and I'll draw 2. If you want to draw your card on my turn where I can hopefully make you discard it, then that's an even better interaction for me. It's a risk that your opponent is taking. It's like I can draw my card to keep up with this advantage, but then I risk getting double down on almost, right? Because if they make me discard it while they have a Prince John, I just gave them an extra draw, or I just opt not to draw and then they just gain the +2 anyways, kind of like a Beast Tragic Hero. And so the best decks in the format, which I do think this is definitely one of them for the set championship local scene, is decks that you see have multiple ways to draw and or dig for cards that they need. So Ruby Sapphire is very good because you look at that deck on the surface and you're like, well, if they don't have Hiram, they have nothing. And that's technically true, but they have a lot of cards to dig for that Hiram. Develop Your Brain, Popsicle Draw to thin out the deck, Ramatalas to scry, Gastons to scry, right? There's a lot of ways that they can try to sift, and you've even seen the introduction of I think it's How Far I'll Go, the 4-cost song that allows them to pick up 2, look at 1, put 1 in the ink, take 1 to the hand. A lot of scry cards to get to the cards that they need, right? They know how important the Hiram is, and that's how they draw their cards. But in this particular matchup, why it can be very rough for you, which I guess is now the second part of this video, is the draw engines that Amethyst Steel have is, I don't want to say, I guess you could say better than Amethyst. Yeah, it is clearly better than Amethyst Steel, right? Because they have the Merlin Min package, they have the Queen's Castle, they have the Friends on the other side, and then they also can play things like the Beast Tragic Hero. And unlikely, But unless they're on the Jafar version, a whole new world, which I think this opponent was on to a certain degree because you saw me rip one of those whole new worlds from their hand. Um, they have a lot of draw to outplay your discard. They have a lot of removal to out your aggro threats. And, if you're playing the lower to the ground version of Emerald Steel, it's like, yeah, my Merfolk is going to get Storm Raged on, or my Glen Rider, they're going to have Strength of the Raging Fire, along came Zeus. So I'm not going to get as much value off of my cards if I can't quest with them and they're not being challenged and discarding. And it's just a really tough situation. So, and then of course, the fact that they can play Robin Hood, which I think my opponent got on like all 3 games here, which is crazy. Like shift Robin Hood all 3 games, so hard to deal with because it's just like, great, now I don't want to quest with things until I can out this Robin Hood, because whatever I quest with, especially with the Merfolk, it's like, well, yeah, you discard, but you're going to get your 2 lore anyway. So any advantage that I somewhat get off of this is just annihilated. Now, this deck does, to a certain degree, rely on certain combo pieces to go off. And what I mean by that is the Sudden Chill being sung with the Ursula Deceiver of All is obviously way better than singing it with just an Ursula Deceiver, but you can do it. And it does allow me to draw one off of the Benja, or not Benja, geez, that's where I just drew for turn, off of the Prince John. But this deck really does, from what I found out at my locals when I was playing this deck, it really, really does rely on you seeing that 3-cost Ursula and it not dying right away. So, we played 5 rounds. I won 3, and then the 2 that I lost, on the draw on both of them for two of the games, and very close matches still. I think it could have gone either way, really. But in the mirror match, I didn't see the Ursula Deceiver of All, and my opponent did, and they had the Let the Storm Rage on combo for it, and I didn't have removal when they dropped their Ursula. And I paid the price for it, right? Like, just that one interaction in this deck is what makes this deck so powerful. So what I've learned is you probably want to aggressively mulligan for a nice curve anyways with this deck, and being so low to the ground, tapping out at like 5 ink as your most high cost cards basically, and you only play like Daisy Duck and Friar Tuck at 4, and then everything else is 3 or less. It shouldn't be too hard for this deck to do that, but the issue that you're going to run into is when you don't have when you mulligan aggressively and you don't have that Ursula, you don't mulligan aggressively, and then you don't get the Ursula. This is why you should mulligan aggressively. Like, it's just such a risk, man, because it really is what this deck functions around. Singing Let the Storm Rage on, drawing 2 and taking out something for 4 damage, huge. Singing Strength and outing 2 threats on the board, for 3 damage each or whatever, huge. Like, against Amethyst, slowing down or preventing the Mim bounce, by clearing their board, forcing them to lose tempo if they want to play a card and Mim bounce at the same time to take out one of your threats. Like, it does so much. It is really, really critical, in my opinion, because the Let the Storm Rage on Ursula interaction is, and it's going to sound silly, but it is a variation of a draw engine, honestly, because it's draw 2, which is crazy. We talked about in set 2 how amazing the Cinderella singing Let the Storm Rage on interaction was. I think the Ursula interaction is actually even better from testing, because every time I got that Ursula sing with the Let the Storm Rage on off, you out a threat, you draw 2 cards, like, oh my gosh, it's such a powerful thing. And then again, if you have the Sudden Chill with the Prince John, it does a lot of work here as well. In this scenario, you see me able to somehow claw back a lore advantage. My opponent is opting to draw cards, and I'm like, thank goodness, because now I can draw off my Sudden Chill. Because one of the other things that's bad about this deck is if you do get to that mid to late game and your opponent has emptied their hand, and you didn't see your Sudden Chills early on in the game, you just know those cards are sitting in your deck waiting to be drawn later on. And that's not a great feeling. So keep that in mind as well. You want to curve out nicely. You want to be able to do these things in order to play this deck effectively. I do think Steel Amethyst is one of the worst matchups because of that reason. They can outdraw your discard. They have a lot of the removal for your aggro threats, like the Tinkerbells, the Grab Your Swords, the Let the Storm Rages on, etc. But other than that, I don't think this deck should have trouble with too much. Obviously, if you let like the top end heavy decks like Ruby, Sapphire, and stuff like that get their game plan rolling, and you're out of gas, you're gonna lose that. Obviously, like you have to play that matchup very aggressively but also again maintain your card advantage. Because the goal with that, with those ramping decks, is you want to stop their ramp. You want to stop them having any cards in their hand that they can continue to fish. Ink with the Fishbone Quill, right? And so if you can keep them on like 4 ink and have them force them to top deck ink basically, and we know that that deck plays a lot of uninkables. That's how you win that kind of matchup. But if you don't do that and they're able to ramp and they're able to get a Hero Midget online, and it's just the match is too far gone, you're gonna lose, right? So overall, a pretty decent deck to consider for your store set championship. Again, in hindsight, maybe it was a mistake to sleeve this up with no experience, but I'm not too upset at my performance considering I wasn't even supposed to go to one of these events, and I did. So it was a great experience. Again, stay tuned for that tournament report if you're interested. If you made it this far in the video, thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.